Hi, this is Chris with MuseGrid. Let's take a look at building some more buttons. So I'm going to take a look at this button pack. I'm going to take a look at these light samples first, and then we'll take a look at the dark samples. So let's pull these onto the page. And you can see there's a wide variety of buttons here. Let's preview. And remember, these are all made purely with Muse tools, no Photoshop used at all. So we have these nice effects. And you can see that these buttons pop off the page here, and we get this nice fade here, and we get these split tone buttons. Let's see how they're put together. Now they're all using a pretty similar technique. They're using a state button as a container, and then they're using various parts. And the great thing with using a state button as the container is that when you move the mouse over, it will affect all the different parts. So even if you've got multiple parts in that state button, they'll be affected, and it'll activate the hover style. So let's take a look at these basic ones down the bottom here first. So we can see if we take these apart, we can see that we have our state button here, and this hasn't got any particular styles applied to it. It's just a transparent state button, and that's being used as the container. Then we have a text frame, much like the text frames we've used in other buttons, but we've just set it to have this pill shape, but only on one side. So it's square one side, and it's got the radius on the other. And then on the opposing side, we have a text frame again, and we've got the other side of the pill button. So we've got the flat edge and then the corner radius. And this is using an icon font. Now the great thing with using icon fonts is that we can change them out really quickly. So if I have an icon font here, let's take a look at what an icon font looks like if you're not familiar with it. We're using the elegant icons here, but we could have, there's all sorts of icon fonts that we can use, and we do have other videos on MuseGrid showing you how to install not just elegant icons, but any icon font, and then those are available. And so once we have those selected, they're available in the Glyphs panel. So now we have all of these different icons available to us in this Glyphs panel, and we can very quickly change the different icons. We don't want multiples, we want to just change that one. We can change how the different glyphs that we're using. So it's a really good way of having being able to create these buttons with the different icons. You don't have to just use these. And the other thing is it keeps everything nice and neat and pixel perfect. So you don't have to try and figure out where you're going to put your PNGs or SVGs to get them nice and neat. So again, this was two parts, and they're both text frames, and we're putting this part here in the top left corner, and then we'll put this part in the top right corner. So that gives us that little bit of spacing in between the two parts. That creates that separation there, and that creates that effect. So this isn't Photoshop at all. This is just pure Muse elements, and then we're applying an orange color to the two halves. But because it's in a state button, when you move the mouse over, the state button is activating the transition between both parts. So these other buttons, all we've done here is just change the radius. So we've changed the radius on the left hand side to 4, and we've changed the radius on the right hand side to 4, and then here we've just switched the radius off completely. Now with these buttons here, the ones above, again we're using the same technique. So we've iterated from this button style at the bottom here. And if we take a look at the different parts, all we've got is we're just now using on the fill, we're just using a gradient that we showed you how to set up in the first basic button style. So we've got this gradient here, and we'll pop that in place. And then on this side, we've got we're using that gradient, and then we're using a stroke, this slightly darker green, that then creates the separator between the two styles. So if we preview these, you can see that we've got that separator. Now on the let's take that part out there so we can see it a bit better. You can see that we've got the line color there of the green, and then on the rollover state we've got the red, because obviously we want it to feel like that's turning, when it changes color, that line, that overlay line is obviously changing color to match the color of its background. So we get this effect here of that line still being intact, but it feels like there's a cut been made into the button, and that when we hover over it's changing. So we're just changing the color of that line as well to give us that effect. Now the next button set up is obviously very easy because it's just two different colors. But when we go to our hover state, we're changing them to the same color. So in our preview here, you can see that we're using a fade transition as well. So because it's the state button, it's making both parts kind of meld into one color. So that's a really nice, easy technique, a nice, simple button, and it's just an iteration of these. Now, these ones get slightly more complex. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove all of these and just have this button here. Let's just focus on this. Let's see how this is put together. So we have a text frame in the background, we have a state button, we have an icon, and then this is just a text frame as well. And then in this text frame, let's put those all together. So we've got our state button there, that's our container. We have our text frame, and then we have our icon in a text frame. Now, in the text frame, we're just using two different text styles. So you can see here that we've got, we're using an Arial, a bold, with this darker grey and 12 pixels. And then we've just shift returned. So instead of creating a carriage return, we've just done a shift return. So it just puts this text onto the next line, but doesn't create carriage return in between. Use the smaller text of 10 pixels and that grey again, and we're just using a regular font size. But then we create that kind of like nice text layout in there. But because we're using the spacing, what it means is that everything again stays nice and neat on the different transition states. For the fill, we're using going from white to a light grey, so we get that feeling of it being slightly domed button. And then to get this effect underneath, all we're doing with this button here is we've got a stroke on the underside, so that the bottom stroke, we've switched this links all the different strokes together. So we've just switched that off and changed that to 3 pixels. So that creates that, again, it gives a kind of 3D depth to this button with the gradient, combined with the gradient. And then in the effects panel, we're using this shadow, 50% black, with a 3% blur and 3% distance, and we're using an angle of 90 degrees, so it's directly vertical. It's not diagonal or horizontal. We're using this vertical. Shadow on it. Now with the state button, what we've done there is we're using a text frame within the state button to create this gradient effect. We could use the state button as well, but we decided to use a text frame. And with that text frame, we're just using a gradient of going from the grey to the white. And that creates, when you combine that with the button, it creates that feeling that there's an inset button there. And again, not Photoshop, just so we pop that back into there. We pop this button on there like that. And because we've used, when we put the combination together, we get this feeling that the button is actually an inset button. And if we pop that onto any other color as well, we'd get that feeling. And then we've got we're just using text frame with an icon font, and we're just popping that into place there. It's hidden there, so let's bring that to the front. And let's just move that into place. And because we're using an icon font, as we showed before, we can modify that font by just clicking in, choosing a Glyphs panel, and then changing the icon that we want to use. So let's put a tick on there instead, okay? So that button, there we go. So that button's nice and neat. Now, if we wanted to change the button shape, let's just iterate. Oh, let's take the whole thing. Using Alt. I'll get there in a minute. And by using the Alt key here, and then we would just go in, select our different parts here, and let's change that to 0, and now we get a nice square button. So it's very quick and easy to change the look and feel of these buttons, again because we're using Muse tools. So that's this button set, these downloaders, or you could use them for anything. We just call them downloaders. They're just buttons at the end of the day. Let's take a look at the dark set of these downloaders.